Good morning. Today is Tuesday, January 30th, 2024. It is 10 a.m. and this is a meeting of Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We're continuing our work on Bill S-213, an act relating to the regulation of wetlands, river corridor development, and dam safety. We have a draft bill that we've been working on, shared with all interested parties, including the Agency of Natural Resources. Agency of Natural Resources has been working hard in the last week to develop a response, and so that's really what we're here to listen to this morning. So good morning, Secretary Moore. Thank you for coming back with your team, and the floor is yours.
Great, good morning. So maybe just quickly go around and I can introduce who's here from ANR. I'm gonna walk through a high level set of recommendations regarding S-213. And then we have prepared draft language, but didn't do it as a red line strikeout, and I think you'll get a sense as to why as I walk through the presentation. But I'm joined this morning by what should be a host of familiar faces, recognizing the extensive testimony your committee's already received, but Ben Green, who's our Chief Dam Safety Engineer, Rebecca Pfeiffer, who manages our Flood Hazard Area Program, Deputy Secretary Gendron, Hannah Smith, who is in our Legal Services section and has been supporting this work, Rob Evans, who's the head of our Rivers Management Program. I think I got everybody from ANR.
Yeah, thank you. We know you're all busy, so thank you for all coming back so we can get as far into the weeds as we want or stay at 60,000 feet.
I'm good at the 60,000 feet. These folks can help with the weed. So just reflecting back that to date, the testimony that the agency has provided regarding 213 has included an overview of the conservation, restoration, and resilience efforts related to riparian areas, river corridors, wetlands, and floodplains that we have that we are currently engaged in, as well as regulatory programs from the National Flood Insurance Program to the recent updates to our wetlands rules, as well as the current rulemaking being undertaken by the Dam Safety Program. And so we really believe that the efforts we currently have underway at ANR make unnecessary some of the proposed sections of 213, and we'll talk about those in a bit more detail here. First, I'm going to start with the sections of the bill that pertain to wetlands, then move into river corridors and floodways, and possible statewide floodplain standards, and then finish by addressing the pieces of 213 related to dam safety.
Sure. Can I ask a high level question? Just to sort of get started. Are we? It's almost like a worldview question, but I think part of the impetus for drafting 213 was that there's an integrated natural resource, waterways, wetlands, et cetera. We're having increasing flooding problems, increasing amount of damage related to them. And the sense was that we could use a more integrated, a comprehensive program, state-led, to manage those resources in a more effective manner. Is that, I don't want to be putting words in your mouth. I'm just trying to see if that was I think the place from which this bill, the perspective from which the bill was drafted.
Sure, and I guess I would offer that the reason in having folks come before you with kind of the overview of what we're doing is I believe a lot of that work is taking place.
Yeah.
It may feel like it flies a bit under the radar, but it is not because it's not being done. Many of those concerns, particularly around river corridors and wetlands, are integrated under the umbrella of our clean water work. But certainly all of the programs you're hearing from, with I guess the exception of the wetland restoration initiative being led out of Fish and Wildlife, all sit within DEC, and I would argue are well coordinated by the agency.
Great. I'm confident that I know that there's much more going on at ANR than I ever know about.
Yeah.
Even when we hear plenty of testimony.
Sure. And just before I jump in though, I wanted to reiterate what I said when I was last in front of your committee, which is to be clear, the agency has no additional capacity to implement new ideas or programs unless they are fully resourced. I'm unbelievably proud of how staff have risen to meet the moment, with either state or federal legislative mandates like the Global Warming Solutions Act, Environmental Justice Bill, Act 59 Conservation Bill, or the deploying the tens of millions of dollars in federal funding, as well as meeting the challenges in helping Vermont recover from recent flooding events. The staff in front of you here, as well as the more than 600 that are back in the office, do it without complaint and serve Vermonters unbelievably well. But our capacity is exhausted. The work in this bill is important. I'm going to give you a sense for where I see the priorities and what you've identified. But make no mistake, what you've envisioned here is a massive undertaking, and in order for this to be successful, it must be appropriately resourced, and that includes both the time to do the work, which I have some significant concerns about, as well as the capacity provided to the agency to support the work.
Sure, and for the record, I want to say again that I've always said that this committee never wants to ask existing staff to just stretch thinner and work supposedly, harder, do more work, and that we need to live up to our side of the bargain, which is providing the resources you need in order to succeed, because we write blueprints, we're not actually building anything, you're building stuff, and we need to provide that support. The issue I've seen, and I call it my own shortcoming, is to be slow to learn how we can genuinely work with you on a program funded in this room. And then when that appropriation competes with all the other appropriations competing for dollars in the budget, trim cuts can be made, and then we don't adjust what we've asked you to do. And so I'm working with the pro tem and the chair of approach to find a remedy, because a lot of those changes happen in the final week of the sessions, and we don't really have a way to true things back up again. And I don't want to fall into that trap, because it's, I'd say, essentially it's unfair to operate areas like that.
Yes, thank you. So as I noted, starting with wetlands, probably at the highest level, just want to note that we agree that better mapping is crucial for wetlands management. We know that it helps developers and landowners understand where wetlands exist, and do the upfront planning needed to effectively avoid wetlands, and also integral to our ability to prioritize wetland restoration efforts. We aligned with the goal of the bill, which is a net gain of wetlands, and would indicate that, or reflect back to you, a net gain of wetlands is already occurring at the landscape scale as a result of that significant fish and wildlife led restoration efforts. And we would not support, or do not support, changes to the wetlands permitting program right now that are contemplated in the bill. In terms of considerations to put out there for you and the way the bill is drafted, wetlands are a water resource. And so I'm unsure, I guess, what the intent was in separating them or making a distinction between water resources and wetlands, but that is something we think would cause more confusion and harm than good. I have a nice figure that shows a little bit about where we are with mapping currently. I believe Laura Locklear may have shared this with you previously when she is in, but we are on track to complete updated national wetlands inventory quality maps for the entire state of Vermont by 2025. This is using resources, a combination of one-time and base money that was appropriated to the agency starting, I believe, in FY21. But we are at this point have sort of worked the kinks out, which is why we started with the Missisquoi River Basin, moved on to this partial mapping of the Lamoille River Basin, and now we'll begin in earnest reflecting the lessons we learned in those initial mapping efforts. There was also changes proposed in 213 related to our current noticing practices, and specifically required newspaper notices and town clerk notice. This is significant additional cost and effort, and we believe for minimal benefit. And so just would caution against that. And then finally, there are some reporting requirements in the bill. And would just ask that efforts be made to align whatever reporting you land on with the reporting we're already doing to EPA in terms of timing, and in terms of substance to the extent possible. So, and I will summarize at the end kind of what we see as the resources that are necessary to support this work. But to comply with S213 as drafted, we believe it would take 5 additional FTEs to implement the wetlands pieces. This is 2 staff for ongoing mapping and reporting obligations, and then 3 staff to work on the permitting and long-term compensation piece. And that's because while there's value to on-site compensation and restoration of wetlands near where the impacts occur, this approach is much more labor intensive than the current approach we use, the in lieu fee mitigation. Expensive and can be hard to find parties interested in serving as long-term stewards. My recommendation to you would be, to the extent you are interested in investing in further wetlands conservation, I would look to expand the work being done by Fish and Wildlife right now, which is largely focused in the Champlain Basin by virtue of the fact that the lion's share of the resources we are using for that work come from the Lake Champlain Basin program, and therefore are geographically limited to that part of the state. Let's see, I think I touched on most of these points. And I guess I just conclude by saying that of the efforts contained in this bill, this one is a lower priority for the agency. I will touch on the things that I see as a higher priority, but to the extent you have to make choices, I would go to other sections of this bill first. And the program just asked me to let all of you know that they will be in the card room later this week to celebrate World Wetlands Day. And would love to have you stop by and talk for it.
Okay, great, we're having a party here.
World Wetland Day. Excellent.
You know, that sort of public event reminds me to check back in, and I'll just put a bookmark into this. When we were talking about rivers and how rivers behave, we heard enticing stories about the water table. And we'll have to follow up and see if there's a way to bring it to the.
We're doing it.
Those
Flume.
Yeah, well, there's mini ones now too.
I was comparing to Rebecca, but.
Yeah,
Frank Lemadusky River has one.
yeah, we're getting one from the, well, yes, yes.
There we go.
Stacy
Thanks.
Conley, like our in-resident flume expert, or river scientist.
We get one from Montreal Museum and Beat.
I don't think that they've done a flume demonstration there. That might have been the Two Rivers Natural Resource Conservation District, or Friends, probably not Friends of the Leaf Speaks, but Montreal, but I'd imagine it might be Two Rivers that did.
But there are tables around and we
Okay.
would love to bring one in. If it's not already en route.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's been a while since there's been a flume in the States.
Senator McCarthy.
You said some of the work envisioned in the bill that the bill assigns to your shop, we would do better to go to Fish and Wildlife.
Well, that's also my shop. In the,
Okay,
that sense.
no, that's not, no, Fish and Wildlife is in your,
Correct.
but you don't want
So this is like emphasizing kind of the regulatory programs, right? And
Yeah.
we permit some modest amount of wetland filling every year, usually on the order of 1 to 5 acres of wetlands are lost through permits issued by DEC. On the other hand, Fish and Wildlife, through the clean water funding and basin program funding, is restoring an average of about 100 acres a year. And what I'm saying is the sort of framework envisioned by this bill is labor intensive and expensive. And to the extent there's resources committed to this work, I think the impact would be far greater if they were combined with the existing Fish and Wildlife around wetland conservation.
if they're doing the work already anyway.
They are, but it's heavily biased towards the Lake Champlain Basin because most of the funding we are able to access for that work comes from the Lake Champlain Basin.
I'm just saying, when a constituent contacts me about something I don't wanna put the time and energy into, and I say, well, Senator White is really.
In this instance, it's all me, so I am swimming out of one pocket to the other.
And I forget the number, maybe you know it, it's something like 146 towns are in the Lake Champlain.
Yeah, it's about half the state, and so, and the. It's also the Lake Champlain Flyway, so there's some real habitat components, the initial concept for that restoration effort was it brought together. Clean water funding as well as some of the habitat dollars we have access to. But you know, that doesn't mean there aren't great wetland restoration opportunities elsewhere in the state, we've just been opportunistic in what we've done today.
How much of Vermont drains into Lake Champlain and how much into the Connecticut?
It's roughly half and half. There's a small portion that goes to Lake Memphremagog and a small corner, northeast corner, yeah.
Southwest.
Yeah, I'm sorry, southwest and southeast. But yes, it goes into the Battenkill and the Hudson. I think it's more than 45% of the state goes into Lake Champlain.
It's not like the Connecticut watershed is nothing.
No, it's also well over 40% of the
Yeah.
state.
I'm just trying to let people know that when we say the Lake Champlain Basin, it doesn't mean Chittenden County.
No, it absolutely doesn't, but it's a geographic area program and those federal dollars have to stay within that geographic area. So moving on to the state flood hazard area standards. As drafted, the expansion of the flood hazard area rule would effectively flip the responsibility for the regulation of all land use within the FEMA flood hazard area and the 274 communities that currently participate in the National Flood Insurance Program to the state. This will be a really significant undertaking. It is not just for new development, but would include modifications to existing buildings, including repairs to any facility taking flood damage. Our best estimate is this is about 210,000 acres of land and 12,400 structures that are located in or immediately adjacent to these mapped flood hazard areas. And just so we're all clear, the trigger for what constitutes development is any human-made change to improved or unimproved real estate. So permitting would be required for development at any scale on those 210,000 acres.
Senator White.
Thank you, Chair Bright. This is an important piece to me, and I understand what you're saying, that this is a big change. And I don't think that that's unknown to the committee. It is a very big change. However, big change is required often when we have major natural disasters that continue to escalate. I'm wondering if you could just, because I haven't heard a good case yet. So I'd love to know what the good case is. Why should our small communities and volunteers be doing this? And are they doing it effectively?
So I think
And then there's a regional component too. I know that our
there's, yeah, I mean, I think there's absolutely a way to better support our small communities. I think there are challenges in that system. And there would be enormous challenges in a state level approach.
They do it, like, are they doing it well now though? Like, I'd love to, I haven't heard that yet, so I'm trying to, if it is true, I wanna.
They are meeting the obligations necessary for them to continue to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. So I don't know what your definition of well is, to my mind, and would refer to Rebecca here. Communities were being exited from the flood insurance program, meaning community members could no longer access flood insurance. That would be a sign of abject failure. That is not happening.
Great.
And so beyond that, I think it's the definition of well is a little bit more subjective. Is it labor intensive? Yes. And so what we're proposing as an alternative here is to develop a statewide flood hazard area standard. It would be consistent. Right now, most, if not all of those communities have their own flood hazard area standard. And so to the extent the agency provides a clear set of standards that are implemented across the state, that are consistent with what's required by the National Flood Insurance Program. It allows us to provide better technical assistance, training, and support to communities in a way that we can't right now.
So, okay, I appreciate you taking the time to respond to that. Do you, but I don't think I'm quite understanding your response, which is to put a consistent standard would open up the ability for you to offer technical support as a state.
Correct.
So, but you don't need more staffing to help.
Oh, no, we'll get there.
Okay, great.
Well, all of this requires resources, to be clear.
And
Some of it requires far more resources.
And what would you say to a town that potentially this would go into effect for? Who is, you know, we've had towns come to us and say, this system does not work for us on a lot of just fundamental, we are on a river at a different point than the town above us. So we don't think about them in the same way. So how would that
So
standard?
to be clear, this isn't river corridors, this is flood hazard areas.
Sure.
And we need to separate, I think, those two concepts. This is
Okay.
fundamentally about the regulation of improvements to develop an undeveloped land. This is about building.
Which can have implications
It can, but
for
the,
other communities.
correct, yes.
Okay, so what would you tell a town what would you say if we do your plan, what would you tell a town is the improvement for this?
That there,
I'll have to make
that there will be
it.
templates and technical assistance and tools made available to them to support their work in this space, as well as training as they bring on new people responsible for administering flood hazard area standards in their community in a way that we can't provide right now because everyone is different.
If I may, is it, my name is Rebecca Pike, I'm the State National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator, and I manage our flood hazard program. I think some of the questions that I hear you asking is, this is really hard for towns to do, and it is. Back when our office was originally developed in the 70s or so, I'm guessing, state statute, towns are required to submit proposals for development to our office for review before they can issue a local flood hazard permit. I think the intention was to help provide the technical assistance that you're speaking to, and we do that now. We issue, 40, 60, 70 of those a year to different communities that submit them to us. So I think part of what the secretary is speaking about is that we are spread so thin,
Yes.
trying to provide that support, especially in post-disaster situation where we're helping them to meet their post-disaster obligations. One of the things that makes it difficult is that every single town has different standards. So before you have any conversation with a landowner, with the town, you're having to open up to see what do they have, how's it different. I think the benefit of a statewide flood hazard standard is that there's that consistency, so the town next to each other, there are different points in the watershed. If all the towns have a higher standard from a starting point that is more protective of the floodplain, we're trying to reduce those impacts that go downstream. That consistency of regulation also allows us to provide tools, and so that towns could potentially in the proposal have a higher standard, but we know the starting place. And so we spend a lot of time doing a lot of basic local land use zoning. So some of our time is spent talking about floodplain development, but a lot of our time is speaking to the town, how do you issue a permit?
Yeah.
This is how you issue a permit.
Yeah.
To warn a hearing, you need to form a floodplain board, so under a DRB type of format, and so this I think can help us provide more of those basic supports.
Yeah.
Because we have like a level starting place.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate your response, and I'll stop asking questions at this point on this topic, but I do think it is a harder lift to ask tiny towns to do this and to build a structure in that direction than it would be to ask the state, which is kind of functioning as a county, as most other places experience it. So I appreciate your response, and thank you so much, Ms. Pfeiffer, that was very helpful.
Thank you, is in having a statewide standard, does that, I hear that it would raise the the standards for a lot of towns. Are there places where that would actually, because it's statewide, would it actually lower the standard?
It's intended to be a floor, right, not a ceiling.
So,
So to the extent, probably the best example I heard now, remember if it came from Robert or Rebecca, was following the 2011 flooding along Lake Champlain shorelines, several lake communities. I think we advocate for 2 feet above base flood elevation. They wanted to go more because obviously they'd seen 3. Our intention is not to say to those communities, no, you can only have a 2-foot elevation. But it is intended to create this consistent framework or foundation that all of the local regulations are built on.
so I'm not necessarily against this idea. But with that, I worry that we're not actually getting the standardization, that it's gonna continue to be a lot of work, because you're still gonna have to look into like, well, what does this town do? Is this the standard or is this more?
If I may, so with. Currently, we have probably about 10% of our towns that have a standard that is equal to our state floodplain rule or may exceed that, so 80-90 towns or so.
Okay.
If we were to go into some level of rulemaking for a proposal for a statewide minimum floodplain standard, some of those rules or some of those towns' standards are what may potentially be contained in the rule. And so we may be needing, so the handful of towns that may have rules that exceed what a state rule might be, I think will be relatively small. And I think in those towns, they are towns that we've been working with for years because they have higher state. So we kind of already know, when I step into this town, I already know they don't allow new structures and we go over floodplain period.
Okay. So it'll be, even though there may be some exceptions, it'll be more manageable.
I think so.
That is the.
So I'm hearing basically you're interested in having a statewide standard, but not doing the regulatory piece behind it.
Correct,
Okay,
it
so
would allow,
currently State local, the standard get defined as state law.
correct. Exactly, that we would be able to provide those sort of administrative resources along with education and training. In support of a statewide standard employee wage.
And is it a mandatory adoption from the statewide standard
That, yes,
by a date certain?
correct, correct. Do other states do it this way?
So what I found out, kind of beating the bushes, there's 2 states that have a state permit, Michigan and Kentucky, the Commonwealth of Kentucky. There are several states, maybe 7 or 8, that have higher standards in the floodway, which is a part of FEMA's floodplain. In Vermont, we have maybe less than 5% of towns that have mapped floodways, so it would be limited in where that potential higher standard could apply. And then there's many states that have adopted the International Building Code, which if they adopt the full code, there are higher floodplain standards, but they're relatively minimal, like extra freeboard, like a foot of freeboard. But they're not, it's more about like protection of building and buildings.
And most states do it as the towns do the permitting and the state sets standard.
Yeah, and I think some of the, even in, I can't speak to Michigan, I know in the Commonwealth of Kentucky that they issue a state permit, but the towns also issue permits. And part of the intricacy of this is that each town joins the National Flood Insurance Program as separate entities. So the town of Bethel joins the flood insurance program, like the city of Montpelier. So I think that we as a state are a community, but if we were to take over permitting, I think there would still be, like the towns would still need to issue permits. Because they are the individual entities that participate in FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program. So to make them eligible for flood insurance in their community, each town would still be issuing a permit. And so there would be redundancy, I think, if there was some sort of a state program where we're issuing a permit, then they would still have to issue a local permit.
Secretary, so I just want to do sort of a time check. I don't know how long the deck is, and I don't want us to rush. I also don't want us to get too far in the weeds and not hear your full presentation.
Thank you, probably should keep moving. I just would reflect that as drafted, we project S213 would take 20 new staff people within the agency. Whereas this modified approach could be accomplished with far fewer Senator Bray, you'd asked a little bit about a proposed timeline for how this work would be accomplished. And this is what we think is reasonable, that we could start the outreach and consultation that would be needed with municipalities and RPCs who are really an important partner in this work to develop that set of recommended statewide standards. We're assuming the bill will be effective July 1st. And then with the goal of moving into rulemaking, through the rulemaking process in 2025. And then starting the work in early 26 needed to update bylaws. And we would prioritize this based on planned FEMA map updates that are scheduled to occur statewide, starting in early 26 and being completed in 27. And so that timing makes a lot of sense, and that folks are gonna need to get into their NFIP or their bylaws anyways, and so we can take advantage of that moment.
The rule was, I think, 6 months long, which seems brisk, but.
Well, it's intended that we're gonna do 12 months of sort of pre-rulemaking stakeholder
It's an
engagement.
engagement process.
Correct.
Rulemaking may be.
That is our preferred approach, is to try to deal with as many of the concerns before we get into formal rulemaking as possible.
Okay, great, thanks.
All right, then in terms of the expanded river corridor regulation. Want to just start by recognizing the critical importance of river corridors. Excuse me. And that expanding jurisdiction over river corridors, we believe, really requires significant upfront public engagement and a much longer term effort that's envisioned here as part of the flood hazard area regulation, or as S13 is currently drafted. Currently it would require us to regulate all mapped river corridors. As I flagged, that's just about 210,000 acres of land. That's 5 times the area that's regulated by the shoreland encroachment permit, which is a staff of 4. And obviously, before we entered into shoreland encroachment, we did a shared roadshow with the legislature, went out and met with communities, heard feedback, but frankly raised awareness that these rules were going to be put into place. Obviously, this will affect an inordinate number of landowners, and absent a really thoughtful upfront public engagement process, it is likely to result in a series of compliance related concerns that are no fun for anyone.
Roadshow sounds more fun than I remember it.
Fair enough. So we would propose to phase this work. The first phase being mapping. So looking at, in particular, infill areas for dense development, sort of taking into account our existing settlement patterns. And then designing a river corridor map amendment and revision process. Next would come education and outreach once we have the maps, to work with the public to understand the maps, and then finally moving into a rulemaking process, and recognize this is a longer timeline than the committee had envisioned. That said, I think it is essential to our success to have that kind of longer runway leading up to this work.
Do you want?
Do you have any work that your team has done to, I know predict is not the right word, but to consider how many floods will happen within that time frame? I mean, I know it's I don't know, we kind of saw some of the hurricane increase coming with like raising of water temperatures. Do you have, how many do you think, or how many does the agency expect will happen before 2030?
I think that is an unknowable question. Certainly the National Climate Assessment makes predictions in terms of the increase in frequency of events, but the chance of an event occurring in any particular year is simply a probability. I don't think.
Do you have any, what did they say the probability is?
I'm happy to share that information with you.
That would be great, like is it 1 a year? I don't know.
I believe in the slides that Dr. Dupini-Giroux presented yesterday to the Climate Council, she indicated that it's somewhere between 1 and 2 events per year.
Okay.
And I think, and have Rob correct me if I'm wrong, but we've had 40-ish federally declared flood disasters in Vermont since 1990, so there's at least 1 year. I mean, this is not to diminish the risk associated with flooding. This is being realistic about how we can be successful with this work.
And we heard the disaster atlas, folks, and that was pretty concerning. Thank you.
So as I noted, to comply with 213 as drafted, we believe we would require about 20 additional FTEs to assume this responsibility for municipal land use regulation. We have done some initial outreach to VLCT, both about the bill, but then specifically our statewide flood hazard area standards approach. If you have not heard from them already, I think you should. They've expressed some concerns about that, how that intersection sits between the state and local regulation. To implement the alternative approach suggested by ANR, we would need 2 additional FTEs to support the statewide flood hazard area standards. So this is really that technical assistance and capacity we would bring to bear for municipalities. And immediately 2 FTEs to support and coordinate the river corridor mapping and contract consultants. We would need additional employees beyond that once a permitting program came to pass though. And we're proposing 2030. And at the end, I have a summary of all of these requirements.
Sure, thank you. So there's a lot of different sorts of mapping going on. Are they, I don't know to what degree they're complementary, or the same team can sort of roll from the focus on wetlands for hazard areas for river corridors, you know, like. Can you?
So we
have a
contract.
mapping.
We've contracted for the wetlands mapping, and that's a particularized expertise. I would look to Rob to speak. I think we have to the way we've shown it in the budget, you'll see at the end. So we're proposing to contract for those services. I don't know if there's an alternative to hire staff to do that directly, but there's capacity needed to do that mapping that doesn't currently exist.
I'm happy to put a little bit of a finer point in it. So for the record, Rob Evans, Rivers Program. The good news is we now have a statewide river corridor map, that we developed in-house after Irene. It took us 7 years to do it, 4 years to create the first version, then additional years to refine the map with our field data. So we have that map. There's the mapping around infill areas you've heard about that will take time, but our existing GIS specialist that manages our river corridor map is maxed out right now with modifications to the map that come from regulatory reviews. And a huge part of the mapping really has to do ahead of a new regulatory program with people understanding what it takes to challenge the map. As I said, I think previously in testimony, once you put lines on a map that tell you where you can and can't build, people want to challenge those lines.
Yeah.
Those lines also get challenged in compliance and enforcement context as well. And it's vastly different than challenging the FEMA map. The type of geomorphic assessment data and analysis that you need to submit to us to review and consider. We may refine the map, we may not. And I think there's a big perception out there that you could modify the map and cut it down by half. If there's a bedrock gorge, perhaps yes, but more often than not, after a lot of back and forth with consultants and education, you might contract the map by 14 feet on each side, or we might look at it and say, oh, thanks, you just showed us that this river is more sensitive and it needs to be wider than what we have this map. So landowners need to be aware of that reality, and our engineering and environmental consultants that do this work really need to be aware of that reality. So that's the foundational work that needs to happen in building out a map amendment revision process and making sure everybody knows what lies in front of us. So
when you're doing wetlands mapping now, I'm guessing you occasionally run into a similar thing. But if people look at a piece of property that they regarded as unencumbered in the way, turns out there's a wetland there. So is that experience around maps and challenging maps totally been piecemeal so far? Or or, you know?
So right now, and so it's a great question because it leads to another important point that needs to be made. Right now, we give everybody the benefit of the doubt. If somebody proposes, whether it's through local river corridor regulation or Act 250 or through our rule, that's those patchwork of jurisdictions that we support. If somebody's proposing to develop in a river corridor, the first thing we do is send out one of our river scientists to get their boots on the ground and make sure we have the map right. Because sometimes we'll get out there and go, oh, there's ledge, there's bedrock, there's confining features here, we should modify the river corridor. Or no, we've got the map right. You can do additional analysis with the consultant and we can tell them what that scope of work looks like. That is retail level, resource intensive work we provide. And again, that happens also in the compliance and enforcement context. And I think we need to flip to a different model where we have a robust map amendment revision process where there's an application and there's a fee we charge for our services because of the time that goes into that. And again, maybe we reduce the number of challenges because people understand that it's a big deal to change the corridor map.
Ready for me to move on to dams?
Yes, ma'am, thank you.
All right. So as this committee knows, the dam safety program is undergoing phase 2 of the dam safety rulemaking process and remains on track for July of 2025. And it is our priority to complete that rulemaking process before legislating on anticipated outcomes of the rule. And so the 213 as drafted gets ahead of our rulemaking process a bit. There is a piece of it that would love to work on with the committee, which is building out the formation of a revolving loan fund to provide critical funding for not just removal, but reconstruction and repair, where there is need to reduce risks to public safety. The governor's FY25 budget does include $1 million to create a pilot of this revolving loan fund program. A couple other flags that I would leave with the committee. As 213 is drafted makes reference to DEC taking jurisdiction over what are currently PUC regulated dams. That transfer of jurisdiction needs to be clarified in statute, and we believe as drafted, it may actually have both of us regulating the same portfolio, which would be problematic. And we agree with the broad strokes that transition should happen. But not on the timeline prescribed in the bill. We are in favor of 2028, recognizing that may be too far out for some. That said, there is an opportunity to have FERC review and potentially take over oversight of some of these facilities, and we would like to leave time for that process to happen before ANR would assume jurisdiction over the rest. And then finally, we just flag, knowing the committee spent considerable time on it, we don't have a position on the section of the bill that addresses liability, as it does not intersect with our regulatory authority. In terms of our planned schedule, we are sort of in this draft rulemaking and public comment community engagement process around phase 2. And anticipating bringing the rules to LCAR in the first half of next year. And as I indicated, adopting those rules by July of next year. So in terms of, there are a couple of pieces in the governor's budget related to the dam safety program, that $1 million that I flagged to provide initial capital for a revolving loan fund. And then there are 2 what are currently limited service positions within Ben's team, and it would transition both of those to permanent status. The committee had previously asked for some rough cost ranges related to dam assessment, design, permitting, and construction. And these are figures that Ben provided, and would defer any questions you might have on them, but the bottom line is there is an ongoing investment needed of somewhere between $2 and $4.5 million a year.
In the high hazard and finding, are any of those in poor condition, or I forget, sorry, I'm not remembering the classification part, like there's poor condition and then there's something above it that's less than 4, but not entirely reassuring.
So, Ben Green, just a second chief dam safety engineer for the record. Of the high hazard potential dams we have, which a high hazard potential dam is one that in the event of a failure or incident, result in probable loss of life. We do have, I believe, 9 of those dams are in poor condition. The one condition rating worse than that is unsatisfactory, which means essentially immediate action is needed. And we are fortunate not to have any high hazard dam, but it's rated unsatisfactory at this time.
So, sorry, did you say none of the 9 are 4 and none of them?
No, there are 9 poor conditions, but none are unsatisfactory, which is considered a worse condition than poor. Unsatisfactory essentially means that we need to take immediate action needs to be taken.
So
Can be done.
if it's rated unsatisfactory, you don't have to spend the money to fix it. Is that what we're saying?
If it's rated unsatisfactory, we need to spend the money to either fix it or remove it right away.
Immediate.
So if we say it's satisfactory, then you don't have to spend.
So the condition ratings are satisfactory, fair, poor, and unsatisfactory. The satisfactory condition dam would be one that, in a broad sense, meets all the regulatory criteria and design standards. And good operating conditions, expects to perform well under all potential flood events or loading conditions the dam may have. And then, a fair condition dam is one that has some likely unknowns associated with performance or some lingering issues. And then a poor condition dam is one that either has a lot of unknowns or it concerns about performance under certain loading conditions. An unsatisfactory dam is one that we're concerned about the condition, but under the current loading condition, essentially immediate action is needed.
forgive me for temporarily narrowing my focus from the whole state to my own particular constituents. We were a little startled to see Silver Lake and Barnard at the top of the list. Am I assured that there's no reason to think that Locust Creek is gonna come storming down that valley and
With the first.
So that's an example of a high hazard potential dam that's rated in poor condition largely because it fails to meet the design standard requirement for safety passage of a large flood event. So under normal condition, the dam is in decent condition. However, for a dam of a high hazard rating, it has to meet a certain regulatory size storm event, which for a high hazard dam is a very large storm event called a probable maximum flood. And that dam does not be able to meet it without overtopping or having it's going to properly control that size flood. So that's by and large one of the reasons why that dam is rated in poor condition.
I respect that certain terms have particular meanings under certain circumstances under the law. A lot of people get angry with me when I think that way, and I say, no, this is, I think we have to be clear on what it means. But in the vernacular, high risk, is that, or high hazard, that's a scary term in the vernacular.
I know, and I mean, we capitalize it to try to make it clear it's a categorization and appreciate that it also feels like we're yelling at you, right? High hazard. But it's a categorization and we do take it seriously, as Ben indicated, it means that were that facility to fail, there could be a loss of life, right? So we have to have some way to organize. And this is a national framework in terms of dam hazard classification, but I hear what you're saying, it's speaking to kind of the worst possible outcome because of the size of the facility, not necessarily the imminent risk. The condition is more.
Are you
an
talking
assessment
about
of risk.
the geography of the topography of the valley below
Both that and how
because
much
it's
water
narrow and steep?
and how much water is stored behind the dam.
The dam itself, to the layman's eyes, looks pretty solid.
It has to do with the location of home. Again, it's hazard potential. So there's a potential under certain conditions, the dam does not meet all the standards, which means that it could have a fragility during a certain flood event. That could cause an uncontrolled release downstream, and there are homes, based on modeling that would be within the zone that would be flooded. To a height that, with less than 50%, better than 50% chance it wouldn't be survivable with someone living in that home. That's the standard that.
And that's because the valley below Barnard is steep and narrow.
Correct, and there are several homes that are near that valley. There are dams that, when we talk about consequences, there are high hazard dams that have, there's a term population at risk, means the number of people that are potentially within that flood inundation should that dam fail. High hazard dam, you only need one potential loss of life to have a high hazard dam, so you only need essentially one home or one road of certain classification in that flood zone to be a high hazard dam. You also have dams like Waterbury Dam, where you're looking at lost life numbers in the near 1,000, should you have a similar event. So there is a range within each of the, it's somewhat, it's almost oversimplification to the high significant, low hazard classifications. Because they're even within that classification system, there's a gradient of consequence levels.
So we're probably too totally reassured now.
Yeah. I should focus on anyone. Yeah.
So to just follow on that next category, significant hazard at 59 dams. Can you say something about, are any of those in unsatisfactory or poor condition?
Yeah, all 59 of those are.
This is just the poor condition.
Yeah, these are just poor
I mean,
conditions, and I do believe I have to check my notes, but I believe there are a small, several of those that we're currently actively dealing with that are not rated as unsatisfactory.
So when I look at the total, I'll use the hot numbers. So it's 70 million, and we're talking about putting $1 million into the revolving loan fund. And which feels like we're not, I mean, I'm not, it's just the math. So how do we address 70 million potentially on the high end in need? Starting with $1 million revolving loan fund, maybe there's other sources of funding or.
part of the challenge here is right now, we don't know if people will take us up on loans, right? What we have heard from dam owners is they don't have resources to invest and or have difficulty accessing capital. This calls the question. Now we have capital you can access.
Does anyone sign up?
Correct. And if not, then we may have to look at alternative solutions, but this is, to me, this is a proof of concept. That's the feedback we've heard, that folks don't have access to the capital needed to make the improvements. So let's see if we can create a revolving loan fund that works. It's not to say we're that this fully capitalizes the need, but it's a start.
Right, it's only year one. So there's, even if it's the same thing for a decade, where it's accumulating, which is better than.
Yeah.
I don't understand the issue here. Just because you happen to have money to build the dam or repair it, that is on a, Mill Pond Dam, where there are 25 or 30 or 40 houses, why would you do it? Why would you repair the dam?
Because we are in the process of rulemaking that requires that work to be done.
We're gonna do that, I give you the dam before I go back.
Well, and at times it does call the question, right, in terms of people removing dams rather than making investments in repairs and replacement.
We're trying to make some decisions on what to do, and it has been suggested that, well, if the folks had the money or could borrow it, everything would be okay.
I did not intend to suggest that. I'm saying that is one of the responses we've received to date. And this is an effort to see how real that lack of access to capital is in terms of folks' decision making.
When you try and push solutions, there are all sorts of best solutions that you've had to date, and I would cross that one off the list. We have problems, and you're sharing with us that things are going well enough, and that there aren't the resources to tackle the issues out there that have yet to happen.
I'm sorry, maybe I don't understand what you're saying.
One of the ways to save money is to declare that that things are under control and the dam is satisfactory.
Yeah, I don't think there's any attempt here to sugarcoat the fact that we have some very significant needs. In terms of the overall dam inventory of the state. The fact of the matter is most of these are privately owned. And so not fully within the control of the agency outside regulatory authorities, and we're looking at ways to get the improvements made or to provide the
So
pressure needed.
What are the lists of ways to get improvements made? If that's what you're looking at, what are the lists of things we can do?
That is the purpose of this revolving loan fund. Is to create access.
I
to
have a
capital.
different, I don't want to revolve, but I'm gonna give you the damn, what the. I'm skeptical. That anyone will be unwise enough. To invest in a revolving loan fund that's made available to them. For something. That they don't have to do.
Except they do have to do it. Right now, it's just a matter of, frankly, in some instances, you can't get blood from a stone. If people don't have resources available to make the necessary improvements, they are unable to make the necessary improvements.
Understood. So if they're not able to do that, what's the state's position on what we will do next before the, if we're the summer coming up to mirror the one we've just had, what would the discussion be here today, a year from now?
Ideally, that we have gone out to a number of these poor condition dams, been able to put together a financing package and improvements are underway.
But I think Senator McDonald's point is the financing package we're talking about is the revolving loan fund. So what would happen in the instance that it is unlikely that someone would take that?
So I think that's where our rules kick in ultimately,
Okay.
come summer of 25.
I haven't brought up the swamp that I mentioned. But most of the rule on.
So under current, I know you're in the midst of rule making, is there an obligation under the current rule or the rule that's coming is going to be the one that makes it clear that you have an obligation to maintain the dams, and right now that's not clear or not inserted at all?
I would defer to Ben to help me answer.
Our current, so historically, the program has not had that authority, the phase one of the rule. Does clearly state the responsibilities of dam ownership and maintaining your dam in compliance with the rules. Phase two of the rules is all the technical standards for which the dam owners will have to meet, so we sort of need that part of the package. To be able to fully compel owners to take action, in situations where you have a high hazard dam that's in poor condition. And the condition continues to deteriorate and the owner's not taking, not investing in improvements and things like that. We'll start to look at other alternatives. They can drain the reservoir. That's still a temporary measure that at least reduces the risk of all the flood conditions essentially. But that's still gonna be viewed as a temporary condition. They still have a dam. They still have to make a decision on a permanent fix at time, whether that be removal or rehabilitation. As long as they owner decision. There's a lot of people on all sides of the fence on what the right thing to do is, but at the end of the day, we need to, at these facilities, have a safe condition, whether that be a rehabilitated dam that's up to standard or one that's not. That's the permanent goal. We have one of those two solutions.
And I don't want to make light of, the Windsor County delegations dam, that is so.
Or heightened concern?
Your heightened concern, so not that we're doing it right here, but what's the best way, if any member of the committee or anyone listening here. Let's stick to the committee. Anyone in the committee has a concern about the particular dam, what's the best way to follow up and learn more, both about the details of the condition and the risk and state plans to, if any, to take action.
That's a great question, thank you.
I think it would come to your team then.
Correct. Reach out to the dam safety program. We can discuss any of the dams in our regulatory or ownership portfolio.
Yeah, great.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so we would email you.
Yes.
Did I understand correctly, the term high hazard has to do not with the likelihood of the dam failing, but with the consequences of a failure if the dam.
Correct. So you can have a unsatisfactory condition dam that's high hazard or low hazard. Hazard potential has entirely to do with what is downstream of the dam should fail, regardless of the probability of failing.
Okay. Should I derive comfort from that regarding Barnard? The dam looks pretty good to the layman's eyes. It's just-
Right, I think what Ben was saying is the concern with that facility is during a major flood event, it could be overtopped and would have, the release would occur in an uncontrolled fashion.
And it's also a dam that we're actively in a comprehensive assessment of the dam to identify alternatives to address that issue and ultimately have that dam be in satisfactory condition. And we're, it's certainly the early steps of that, but that dam's moving through the process in a positive direction.
Overtopped as opposed to dam collapse.
Correct.
Yeah, it doesn't have the.
Well, overtopping and then eroding and then
Yeah.
essentially having uncontrolled release.
Okay. One other question, you know, we're hurting time minutes. Again, being parochial, there's a string of lakes in town on it. And that's basically an old stream dammed up.
Yeah.
At various places. I've gotten complaints from constituents down there that one of those dams is privately owned and the owner is not taking care of it. So that you have an entire lake upstream in which everybody involved and the public is, what do we do with something like that?
I imagine maybe referencing Amherst Lake. That's an example of a significant hazard dam where the conditions continue to deteriorate. The private owner was not able to financially take on a rehabilitation project at that time, so we had them actually temporarily lower the level several feet to reduce loading on the dam to theory buy time by reducing the risk temporarily to make that decision on what their next moves were going to be. The dam was since I guess sold for $1 to essentially a lake association who's trying to raise funds to restore the dam. So that got some positive forward movement, but that's sort of the unfortunate consequence of dams, as many of them are, believe it or not, privately owned. They impact people well beyond just the dam owner themselves. The dam owner holds all the risk and liability, and ultimately fiscally responsible for the facility. So it becomes a very large burden on a private person.
The lake is a public asset though. The lake upstream of the dam is a public asset. But the state can't force the owner to fix it.
Rulemaking.
In our rulemaking, we'll be able to compel the owner to either again repair or ultimately move to a permanently stable and safe condition, which is ultimately the direction we're heading is this dam going to be removed or going to be restored and rehabilitated?
Correct.
I don't think we quite know the answer yet because they're still kind of working through. Looks like they're moving the rehabilitation route at this time, but I think they're trying to raise funds. I think that's a challenge for that's I think one of the big challenges there. If the money was in pocket, I think the construction project already done.
Right, and I think that's an important point. We're sort of frankly agnostic on whether people repair or remove in most instances. And that is maybe a challenging conversation with other property owners around a particular water body. But that Ben's team's interest is public safety. As opposed to recreational access or other concerns that may arise in the future.
Okay, Senator Watson.
Thank you. I'd like that we have at least $1 million, hopefully, that we can put into this revolving loan fund. Just so you know how I'm thinking about this. I appreciate that it's a proof of concept. Will this actually motivate change? That's great. My head is already 2-3 years down the road. And it doesn't matter whether or not it is a proof of concept because either it works and so now we need a lot more money, or it doesn't work and we need a lot more money, right? And so I'm thinking about what is the mechanism? How are we going to, because we need to, either it's through the damn revolving loan fund or it's some other strictly grant oriented tool, but either way, we need to generate a lot more funds. And I realize, asking you to what should that mechanism be right now is not a useful question, but I just want you to know that that's something that I'm thinking about. And I think about the logic of tying costs to those who benefit from the service, and that's not a very, that would be a huge thing to say, all the people downstream are benefiting, and so do they have a role to play in paying for the upkeep of, let's say, like a flood control dam. How that connection is made in terms of paying for a service, I don't know. I'm not even sure that's the right tool, and I hesitate to even say it like on the record, because I don't know if that's the right tool, but I just want to put out there that that is important, and I think we need to start thinking about it now, because we do need to capitalize this significantly.
Yeah. Also.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, we've talked about funding off and on, just in a general way. I don't know if you've given any, so that's a general fund, $1 million goes to the loan fund. Have you given thoughts to any funding mechanism other than just a general fund allocation on an annual basis?
No, I mean, we can jump to my last slide, which is sort of the summary of resources necessary in terms of S213 is drafted. With our recommended changes, and as I say, Hannah's got language that we're happy to share with the committee, although it may be been submitted already, that would capture all of these pieces. But in either instance, there is a significant base need within the agency to support implementation of either version of this stuff.
Either version. Your version or our version versus Pat's version.
Correct, I'm only for the conversation here. Can add an extra column to my table.
No, it's like,
Let me look at the House version. But just in terms of sort of staff within the agency, particularly in the river corridors pieces Ross spoke to, there's also need for significant contracted support around the mapping components. And then the recognizing some additional capitalization or investment in dam safety as well. And just want to be clear that there are more people needed when we get to a permitting program when it comes to river corridors that aren't fully reflected in either one of those budgets. And maybe just some closing thoughts from me is that I really appreciate the intent of S213. The importance of wetlands regulation and restoration, river corridor and floodplain protection and dam safety as the need to become more resilient and respond to the impacts of a changing climate feels really urgent in this moment. This bill, as with so many other pieces of legislation that are currently under consideration here, is full of really important ideas and good intentions. And frankly, if resources were no constraint, a lot of things we would love to do. However, we are resource constrained. And our staff, my staff are stretched really thin right now with no capacity. As drafted, and as you've heard from the experts in my shop, S213 is unmanageable. And I hope you will take seriously that feedback. I brought you a set of recommendations here to a more stepwise approach that supports Vermonters in becoming true partners in this work. And that still requires a significant investment of resources. And maybe to go full circle, Senator Bray, with your opening remarks, as you work towards the version of a bill that you will ultimately vote out of committee. I implore you to do so with a clear understanding of the actual resources that General Assembly, not this committee, but the General Assembly is prepared to commit to supporting this work and match the scope to that reality, as opposed to the resources we wish were available.
Well, I'm thinking a lot with the committee, with you and the committee, but maybe the bill should say contingent upon availability of funding. Just say it in the fund again. So that we're clear.
Thank you.
So the A&R proposal. Can you explain again the total there, 3 million base and 750 one time, what those two are? And
So
where they
the
come from?
Well, so as envisioned here, it would be a general fund ask. We haven't proposed any alternate source of funding. Of that, about $750,000. These are just rough
Yeah.
round numbers for staff costs. We budget at $150,000 a staff person.
Yeah.
So this would be funding sufficient for 5 new FTEs, spread across wetlands, flood hazard areas and river corridors, as well as a larger investment, much to your point, Senator Watson, more on the grant side of the, dam safety needs to ensure that we are able to deal with all poor condition facilities. In addition, so those are base, those are annual needs, and then in addition to that, as Rob spoke to, there's some significant mapping needs around river corridors, and this would be an investment of one-time funds in creating those maps.
Okay. So is this one time though going to be ongoing?
Well, that's the base.
You know, like that we're gonna need to do mapping. We have like
It's a phase,
sort of a
so
rolling series of mapping.
I guess I would say it's a phased approach, right? And this is, that $750,000, if we go back to it, reflects sort of the first phase of that work, this 24 to 26 work. I can't, until we get to the other end of that, it's a little hard to suggest if there would be additional contracted or staff support needs, other than knowing when we get to an expanded permitting program, we'll need more people to administer our expanded permitting program.
Senator McDonald, and then Senator West.
I hear two things. I hear the secretary say, ask what resources would the legislature suggest be committed to this work? And as a member of the legislature, we're saying to the secretary, Madam Secretary, what resources is the administration willing to commit to this work? And when we make suggestions on what we might commit, they don't seem to be welcome. So we're saying to you, why don't you make some suggestions and see if we welcome them? But right now, we're speaking right past each other. The people in Barry, the people in Montpelier are saying, what's the matter with these clowns? They're just, they ask the other side a question and fold their hands and expect the other side to answer when they themselves won't answer. And that's for both sides of this. This is not being critical of you, it's what is causing the failure of us to come to the resources that we would be willing to commit? Where is the holdup?
But there are other competing priorities that sit outside the Agency of Natural Resources that are consuming the capacity within the general fund of the state of Vermont. We have made investments in the pieces that I have advocated for with the governor, including a base appropriation for wetlands mapping, the $1 million to capitalize the state revolving fund, the creating full-time positions in the dam safety program. And to the extent there are priorities that go beyond that, I'm saying I support them. I have the luxury of focusing on one piece of the overall work of state government, as does this committee. And there are going to be competing demands for those finite dollars, and they would need to come at the expense of something else.
Well, that's
Well, they are already.
that's a gentle and way of saying, but a long way of saying the problem that we look at. Which is we both talk about how willing we are to work with the money available, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but no one's come up with it. And, well, it's a past. I don't know where it's a past to. It does deal with what's hazardous.
Well, to just get a finer beat on what you're talking about, can we go back to your final slide and say, and ask of the total that's down to 3 million base, 751 time, how many of those things are in government, the governor's?
Yes, that's exactly. Yeah. None of these things are in government, especially.
And then outside this is the 1 million revolving loan fund, and that is addressed.
Correct. Along with the money for wetlands mapping that I think was prescribed by your bill, that I would argue is already underway and on its way to being completed.
you know,
Thank you, Chair Bernay. That was my exact question was, I haven't seen your budget yet. I don't know if it's been sent to us from ANR or if when we receive that, but I'd love to see that when it's available, if it's done.
Yes, I mean, the governor's budget dropped last week, so.
Okay, I didn't get that. I didn't get the budget. Like it used to be, I thought we got a copy of it.
So
So
generally,
that's a-
yeah, I mean, generally we come into the committees of jurisdiction and provide a
Yeah.
budget
Are we
presentation.
not doing?
We've been invited into the House Appropriations Committee, and to my knowledge, that's the only committee we've been asked to provide testimony on our budget.
Can we ask them to come in?
yeah, I think you, sure, we'll come back to budget.
Okay.
The other thing is, the tradition has changed lately. We have budget books when we came out of
Yeah.
the budget address, and I know there's an online available budget summary, which I downloaded, but I don't know that it got distributed automatically to everyone, so.
May I request that? As an individual member, is that something I'm allowed to request?
It's all on the JFO website or the finance and management website.
So I should instead ask legislative.
I mean, I'm happy to,
I'm asking. I can email you a link.
yeah.
I guess I always loved when we got the transportation budget book, because I like to go through and I bring it with me to public meetings when people ask questions.
Yes.
So it is helpful to have a printed copy. I'm happy to pay for a printed copy, I guess is what I'm saying, but we used to get one, so that's beyond the point. The point of the question is, I don't know what's in your budget. And is there what is in your budget? What is the comparison for this chart? Is
I
there?
would say, like, if I added another column here, it would say in wetlands that we are still drawing down the balance of $250,000 worth of one-time money, coupled with a $100,000 increase to our base to deal with mapping. And that is a dam safety space in so that $100,000 will be part of the FY 25 budget, in addition to having been part of the 24 and 23 budget.
So that is the same, the top line is the same as for your A&R changes, is what you're telling me, you have grant funding for the wetland piece?
It's not grant funding, it's state general fund.
Oh, I apologize, could you explain it again then?
Yes, so what I was saying is if you're looking for where we have resources that have been placed into the budget to get at the priorities identified by this bill. I would argue on the wetland space, we're doing much of the mapping work envisioned by the bill. Using resources that were provided by the Governor and General Assembly, I think, starting in FY 23.
Okay, so the 250,000 you just referenced
Was FY 23
was
one
FY
time.
23.
At the same time, we received a $100,000 increase in our base appropriation in our Office of Waters. And that is being used to fund the mapping on an ongoing basis.
Okay, so the person who is in the wetlands department remains temporary and then they go away? Like
There is no staff, this is contracted support that we're using to perform the mapping. That one FTE is a reflection of trying to suggest a compromise with what the committee has laid out in terms of doing this very close at hand mitigation, some fairly extensive reporting obligations. And I think assuming we would have some stewardship liabilities, we've downsized that to just focus on the reporting and monitoring obligations. As I indicated in my remarks, I would not put that wetlands position as a priority compared to the other things shown on this chart.
So currently there is no staff person doing this work now, it is a consultant, is that?
The mapping work, we have,
I'm truly just asking questions because I want to understand.
so we have program staff in the wetlands division that are responsible for administering the regulatory program, including in instances where there are permitting impacts to wetlands, to direct them to the in lieu fee mitigation program for those impacts to wetlands that cannot be avoided or otherwise minimized.
So you've got that.
And we have staff in the Department of Fish and Wildlife whose job is to do wetland restoration and conservation.
And you contract out the
For
additional mapping piece.
Correct.
And what is the contract amount for the mapping? And where would I find that in your budget?
I don't know what the contract amount is for the mapping, and you would need to get way deep in the weeds of our budget. Like,
Yeah, that's
not
what-
below the Office of Waters and I mean, if you wanna get into it, we can go line by line.
This is important.
It's a $300 million budget.
Yeah, it's important stuff.
Okay.
So I would love to understand, because if you don't need to have a consultant, but you can have a staff person do this or more staff people, that seems like a long-term investment versus.
I think the consultant is frankly, we determined it's a more efficient way to go about this work. Because once we get through this initial mapping, we had a fairly significant slug of updates that were required, and the maintenance of effort is much lower. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to staff up while we improve our admittedly aged and inaccurate maps. Once we get them all up to kind of a current standard, the maintenance of them should be a lower cost effort than what it took to get them. Which is what we're in the middle of.
Okay, yeah, I guess I'd like to understand it more. So I won't dig any deeper on this question, but if I could just ask one additional.
Sure, but I think it'll be helpful for us to get the link to the details, so we can start from shared information
Yes.
as opposed to fishing.
Bingo. Is there a way we could get that? Like you could make this chart and show us what the governor's budget is currently with it? Like we could get this slide.
So there is nothing on this slide that's reflected in the governor's budget. I would have to add another column that indicates where the governor's budget is making investments related to, in particular, wetlands and dam safety.
Yes, and you're making a very compelling point that you're already doing the work.
Some of the work.
Great. So I would love to know what you just told me a consultant is doing that now. That's new information to me. If I had that and I could point to it, when constituents come to me and say, why the heck is the state doing this? That would be very helpful. Does that make sense? Like, okay, I'm not trying to argue that you are making a wrong or right decision. I'm trying to explain to you that it is very tedious and hard for us to make a case for the state not funding something when people show up at meetings and tell us that they feel in danger. And we don't have a thing to point to that says the state is doing this. So if you're able to do that, it would be very helpful. And it would make me less likely to be as forceful in my statements that the state is not doing it. Interesting, thank you. And my only other question on the dam safety piece is what is in the dam, what's the dam safety amount? Is it? Because you don't have the staff broken out here, and I've seen a few different presentations with different examples of temporary staff.
We can provide sort of the current staffing levels for each one of these programmatic areas. This is specifically the plus up required to address the scope of the bill. It does not reflect the work already ongoing in the agency and part of our base budget.
Okay, so you don't have the temporary staff in your changes becoming full-time. That's not what the 2.5 million is.
No, that is to invest in construction, essentially. The moving those two limited service positions to full-time is essentially budget neutral.
Yeah, that's what I was understanding. Okay, thank you.
And you for technical. So thank you for to you and your staff for
Yes.
really reviewing the proposal, coming back with another way to work on the same body of work. And we'll communicate testimony. My goal for our committee is that we will build a vote a week from this Friday, so we're gonna be down into black and white between the four corners of the page face. Do you have a strike all or markup?
Heather, do you have that or?
I emailed that to you this morning, so you have
Okay.
the version, we can give you what is the red line version.
Yeah.
But we gave you what our alternative was, because it is the actual language versus it gets kind of pretty messy.
Yes.
Sorry, so I'll give that to you separately.
Okay, great, thank you very much. Make sure we will post it on our webpage and distribute it to committee members. So committee, we are gonna take more testimony starting at 11:30, and since we've been churning right along.